The intersection of politics and foreign policy, as you know, has never been more complex, but chaotic might be a better description. For years, though, that has been Steve Okun's happy place. His sharp analyses have helped find us meaning and at times humor in a dizzying news cycle that is often overwhelming, even for those like you who are covering it day to day. Steve is CEO and founder of the public affairs and sustainability firm APAC Advisors. He has served as both chair of AmChams of Asia Pacific and AmCham Singapore. As a member of the Clinton administration, he served as a deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Please welcome Steve Okun. And and just one note, he's going to break up his discussion in 3 parts. So you're welcome to fire away questions after. It'll be obvious after each section. So Steve, many thanks for doing this again.
Thank you. It's great to be back. So as Kevin mentioned, I'm CEO of APAC Advisors. Thank you for not laughing at that photo. That is, of course, not of course, but that is me back when I worked in the Clinton administration. And so I post this to say, look, I'm a Democrat. I worked on the Clinton campaign. I worked in the Clinton White House. I've worked on a Democratic campaign since. But I really try and take my Democratic hat off and speak of this from a nonpartisan perspective, to speak of it truly from an American geopolitical perspective, to try and give you that perspective today so that you'll understand what's happening in the United States, why it's happening, and what it means for us here in the region. Now, to really understand what we do as APAC Advisors, we see our role as connecting the front page to the business section. You used to not have to do that when you worked in companies and in finance. You would really just read the business page, and then that would help you decide to do what you did. And of course, those of us in government, we focused usually more on the front page. But now, if you are in the business community, if you are an investor, you need to connect the front page to the business page. And that is what we do at APAC Advisors. Now, to understand where we are, at this stage in geopolitics, you need to understand where the United States is and the role that President Trump plays. This is an op-ed that my Clinton colleague, Thurgood Marshall Jr. and I wrote, is a preview to the incoming administration. So we wrote this in January, right before the inauguration last year. And we wrote that Donald Trump was going to be the most powerful president the United States has had since FDR. Why has Donald Trump been able to do that? Why did we think he was going to do that? And that is because the U.S. system, a system of checks and balances, where we are supposed to have 3 co-equal branches of government that check one another: the Congress, the courts, and the executive branch led by the president, had always been there was always battles between the 3, always tensions, but they have always been co-equal and checked one another. Donald Trump came in saying he wasn't going to do that. He was going to ignore, to the extent he could, the other 2 branches. And to a large degree, the other 2 branches have allowed him to do so. That is what has made him so powerful. And it is what continues to make him powerful. So basically, ignore anything that you read that says Donald Trump is entering into his lame duck period. Donald Trump is losing power. That is not true within the United States. We haven't seen it true yet, and that's what's going to impact us out here. So what is it then Thurgood and I wrote in January as we started to head into this year? We said that Donald Trump was going to be more constrained at home because domestic politics were going to kick in, but he was going to be unchecked abroad. Now, when we wrote this, we knew he was going to focus more on foreign policy, and he was going to use his power more in foreign policy. We did not think he was going to kidnap Maduro. We did not think he was going to launch a war against Iran, but it's very consistent with what we have seen. and what we saw coming. And we think that is going to continue for the rest of this year and into the next 2 years, especially, and we'll talk about the midterms later, as the Democrats get power and that check of Congress does start to kick in, it doesn't kick in from a foreign policy perspective. So as tumultuous as the first 2 years have been, the next 2 years could be even more tumultuous from a foreign policy perspective, something we need to prepare for and understand and think through for those of us who live and work in Asia. Why is this so difficult now? Because we are living in a world that we have never lived in before from a geopolitical perspective. We live in 3 worlds simultaneously. We live in a unipolar world. The United States can basically do what it wants to do so long as Donald Trump is president and is unchecked. And we saw this with Venezuela. We saw this with Iran. And there is very little the world can do to check him. It looks like maybe he got checked in Greenland. Maybe that check came in. And we'll talk about U.S.-China in a moment. But for the most part, when we look to see what's going to happen in Cuba, whatever will happen in Cuba is going to be what Donald Trump and with regards to Cuba, Marco Rubio decides. It is a unipolar world in that regard. But at the same time, it is also a bipolar world, and it's a bipolar world between the U.S. And China, because China does have one check that it has used and will continue to use on the United States and the rest of the world, and that, of course, is rare earths. So when it comes to the U.S. and China, we are in a bipolar world. It will be interesting to see if that bipolar world becomes a G2. Because if we move into a G2 world, and it is unclear that that will happen, but if we did, that will have ramifications for every other country in the world. How will their agency be taken into account as China and the U.S. and Trump and Xi have this G2 relationship? We are not there yet, but it's possible we're going to go there. One of the real themes to watch. And while all of this is happening, we are also in a multipolar world. We see this, and I'll talk about this when we get to the trade section, of governments outside of the U.S. and China coming together. And we see this with the CPTPP and its expansion. We see this with the EU-India deal. And we're going to see this with other deals in the Americas. And that multipolar world doesn't include the U.S. and China. So very hard to navigate a geopolitical world where you have a unipolar element, a bipolar element, and a multipolar element happening all at once. But what drives all of this really is U.S. and China. And now I want to give you a very American perspective of the U.S.-China relationship. There is bipartisan agreement in the U.S. on China. When I went to China for the first time in 1999, all of my American friends said to me, "That is so exciting. We are so jealous. We've never been there. We want to go there. There is such a bright future for the U.S. and China. Look what we're going to be able to do together from a people-to-people perspective. Look what we're going to be able to do from a government-to-government perspective." And that happened in the 90s through the early 2000s. More Americans had a favorable view of China than an unfavorable view. And that lasted until roughly 2012. And in 2012, it flipped. And it has accelerated that flip, and it's bounced back a tiny bit because of Trump's language towards Xi, I think. But for the most part, Americans are aligned in their unfavorable view of China. That happened in 2012, and it has basically accelerated ever since. And what this change is not any change in Washington, D.C. Nothing changed in Washington. Nothing changed in the United States from the early 2000s to the early 2010s. What changed was in Beijing. Beijing is what changed. And it is that change in China that you need to understand that drives the U.S.-China relationship today. Nothing drives me crazier. And if any of y'all write this, you'll probably get an email from me when you talk about the U.S. trade war on China or Trump started the trade war. That is not the case from the American perspective. China started this trade war, started it somewhere in the early 2000s and accelerated from 2012 onward. So if we want to get one starting point that you really need to understand if you are going to write about US-China, if you're going to write about trade, is Made in China 2025. This was China's plan that came out in 2015, in which China said it is going to dominate the 10 sectors most important to the global economy by 2025. And they were going to do this through a mix of protectionism and industrial policy. And China was extraordinarily prescient, no surprise, in 2015, picking out what are those sectors that are going to be most important to those of us in the room today. New information technology, high-end machine tools, robotics, aerospace, advanced rail, new energy, EVs, biopharma. Those are the sectors that China said it is going to dominate going forward. And they did this to transform China into an advanced manufacturing leader. It worked. It wasn't perfect. They didn't hit every goal they had in Made in China 2025, but they hit a lot of them. And everybody saw this coming. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce in 2017, so nearly 10 years ago, said if Made in China 2025 gets implemented, this will put the U.S. and China on a path of separation rather than integration in critical commercial areas. They got it exactly right. And while China no longer refers to Made in China 2025 because it's something that the Americans and Europeans and Japanese all have great deal of concern with, they've continued along this path. And their latest 5-year plan is now focusing on what is critical going forward. Now it's quantum technology. Now it is biomanufacturing. Now it is nuclear fusion. Now it is brain-computer interface. Right? This government in China is they have extraordinary foresight. They have extraordinary amounts of capital. They have extraordinary amounts of control in which to make all of this happen. And this is what is going on. And this is why the United States, Democrat, Republican, Trump administration, Biden administration are all very concerned about what's happening and are taking action to prevent this from happening so that China doesn't dominate the 21st century as they are laying out to do. China also has a policy called dual circulation. And what this policy says is that China is going to keep its domestic market for itself, but then it is going to have export so that it can dominate export markets. So China wants to have domination in both its own domestic market and in export markets. And when this policy of dual circulation came into effect in 2019, we look what happened to 2025. Imports have basically remained flat into China, but exports are up nearly 50%. Another very successful policy, dual circulation. So if you want to write about US-China trade, and you want to write about all of the things the United States is doing, by all means do that, but understand what China's policies are. Go back and study Made in China 2025. Go back and look at the recent 5-year plan. Look at their policies like dual circulation, and then you will get the understanding of why what is happening today is happening. So where are we now? The other thing that I will probably send you an email on is if you say the US and China are at a trade truce. We are not at a trade truce. The trade war between the US and China is still very much active. I will say we are at a stalemate. We are at a strategic stalemate in this trade war because both sides have a lot of leverage over the other. They are using or threatening to use that leverage over the other, and that is why we are now at a stalemate, but we are not at a truce. The summit that just happened between Trump and Xi did not deliver much. Beijing believes it is gaining ground and that a pause in the trade war is to their benefit. And there is still a lot of action going on from the United States in concerns of export controls and restrictions and it's coming out of Treasury, it's coming out of Commerce, it's coming out of the Federal Communications Commission. So this is all still very much going on, and we are likely to see a summer of action between the US and China. We are seeing the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, move on connected systems, this Internet of Things, and they are the United States government, very concerned if China gets into the Internet of Things, that it will give them access to the United States. The US is worried, of course, about AI, is putting on tighter export controls, and now we have to see what the US is going to do on its latest decision to sell arms, about $14 billion to Taiwan. That has been paused by the president, and we will have to see where that goes forward. So this is going to be a very potentially busy summer on the US-China trade war front, because it will slow down before Xi Jinping goes to the United States in September. The US won't take action in the lead up to that. So there are a month or two this month, next month, maybe into the beginning of August, where all of these types of things can happen. So I'm going to pause here on US-China and see if you all have any questions or reactions. Yep.
Hold on. Let us get a
Okay,
mic
we'll
to
get
you.
you mics.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm Sathit from Bangkok Business Thailand. I just want to go back to the dual circulation graph a little bit. I think it's quite like on the opposite side with what He Lifeng, the vice premier of the Chinese government, said during the Davos in January. He said China will open up more market for the world, but it's quite the opposite from this graph. So my question is, what level or how much can we believe in what the government of China, said? Thank you.
Yeah. Look, from a business perspective, from an investor perspective, China is not an option for the business community. It is essential. I mean, we're talking about the second most important market in the world. Businesses need to be there. Investors need to be there. The Chinese want, they want business investment into China, but they want it typically on their terms. And this is where I think if you're a business or an investor, don't invest in China, but understand what you're investing in, what the rules are. Certain sectors are going to be much more welcome than others. So I would say, yes, of course, China does want investment, and US and Western and European investors want to be in there, but they want to be in there on a level playing field. They want to ensure that their intellectual property is protected. They want to make sure that there is rule of law. So there is all of those concerns. Again, now that said, there's a lot of businesses that do really well in China. So you have to understand what sector you're in and look at that and say, yes, but you have to be there. You have to be there. And what, frankly, it's even more important now for Western businesses to be in China because of these policies that were set, because of Made in China 2025, because of all of that investment that went into China. China now has some of the most innovative, competitive, cutting-edge companies in the world. And if you are not there, and this is the argument a lot of US businesses are making back in Washington, because they're concerned they're not going to be permitted to invest into China, that there's going to be investment restrictions for US businesses going into China. And that is going to be really, really troubling and damaging to US businesses, because if you're not in China and you don't see what the latest technology is, you don't see what the businesses are doing in terms of robotics, in terms of physical AI, you are going to be left behind. And so you have to go in. So there is a lot of tension in that relationship. But businesses, investors recognize the importance of needing to be there. And they're trying to make that case both in Washington and in Beijing. Yep. I'll wait for the mic. All right.
Hi, this is Asaduzzaman from Bangladesh.
Yeah.
I'm working for the Daily Star. As we know that Bangladesh is a heavily import-dependent country, and there is a trade war between US and war. And all of you know that Bangladesh has signed recently an agreement, US tariff reciprocal trade, when Bangladesh is most heavily dependent on import, and there is a signed up a trade agreement. There is a dilemma. What do you mean that Bangladesh should maintain the relationship between two countries? Thank you.
I mean, in a way, that's a dilemma for most countries. How do you balance between the U.S. and China? Because you have the U.S., and we'll talk about this in a moment, what their trade policy is, and the anchor to the Trump administration's trade policy is tariffs. So you have that concern, but then you have the concern as well, depending on the country, of the excess capacity that China has and the dumping of that into many markets, which is what happened to some degree in the United States. And it is why you see countries putting a lot of tariffs on China, especially on electric vehicles, because you have to have, I know Bangladesh doesn't have the auto manufacturing sector, but you have to have an auto manufacturing sector for your national security. And so if you are not going to protect your auto manufacturing sector from excess capacity, and you have China coming in with great vehicles at a unfairly low price in many ways, coming in and dominating your electric vehicle sector, and that hurts your auto sector, then that hurts your defense sector. So this is where national security and economics have been intertwined more than ever before. And so it is very difficult for a country like Bangladesh. It's difficult for a country like Singapore, more and more, to say, well, we don't want to have to choose between the U.S. and China. But that choice is starting to come, and that's what's driving the move to a multipolar world. But that is going to take a while, and we'll talk about that in a second. So one more China question. All right, two more China questions, and then we'll move to the trade section.
Got to get this side of the room represented here. Yeah.
Hi, Annelien Greef. I'm from Brussels newspaper The Standard, but I'm based in Jakarta. A question on Trump and Xi. Would you say, some people would say, you mentioned the bipartisan support, but it does seem like Trump is a bit more friendly these days for Xi. Has that changed? Is Trump 2 very different from Trump 1 in that sense? And who does he listen to? Who are his advisors? Has that changed? Kurt Campbell would say he only listens to himself, but I don't know what your view is on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say President Trump is more open to China than almost all of his advisors and most of the U.S. government, frankly. So it is something that is really going to be important to watch in September as we go into this, because that is, one of the questions that we want to grapple with from a broader geopolitical perspective is, are we moving back towards an era of spheres of influence, the same as we had, during the Cold War. And here you would basically could have 3 spheres of influence. You could have the U.S. sphere, you could have the China sphere, and you could have the Russian sphere. And now that doesn't mean that there are no rules would apply in any of those spheres, but people would be dominant those. Is the U.S. willing? Is Trump willing to go into that G2 world? Go and willing to give Xi Jinping more leeway in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits, and up in Northern Asia. Most of his advisors probably would not be aligned with that. But so far, it is very clear that Donald Trump, when he wants something, that's the direction it goes. And it certainly was the case with Iran. And the question is, will that be the case with China? It's an open question right now. It's the right question to ask, and it's one we're all watching. Was there one more here and then one there? Okay.
Thank you so much. As you said that we have to connect the first page with the business page. So from the perspective of not only trade, from the perspective of an empire cycle, we have to look at US and China. Because in 1980s, according to National Geographic, 80% of the research and development conducted in the world contributed by US. Now the picture has changed. I think it has come down to 50 or 40. So US has changed its priorities. If you look at the cycle of an empire, when it reached at the pinnacle of the success or at the apex, so it tried to exert its pressure, its force. So US has focused on its to exerting pressure in the world. So they have changed their priorities. Expenditure is being done. There are at least said that more than 700 bases throughout the world. So it's not about trade. China has started to focus to grow. China has started to focus on economic development. China has started to focus on exports. As you have said that it's initiated in the beginning of 2000, 2005 that China focused on these sectors. So we have to look at the perspective of an empire, the strategy of the empire as well. China is a petro state considered because it's exporting. China is considered as an electro state. It's exporting electron, solar energy. As US is still relying on as a petro state. LNG focus on Trump focus is also on he always said that the climate change is nothing and we need to abandon this strategy. So can you tell that at the cycle of an empire, trade strategies also change?
Well, I think what's really changed from the United States is even under Trump 2 versus Trump 1, but certainly from Trump to every other president. It wasn't that the United States, I would argue, viewed itself as an empire and would then have this, bilateral relationship with every country and look to leverage every country for its own benefit. What really changed under Trump in Trump 2.0 is that we no longer work with our partners and allies. We don't treat them as partners and allies. And that is what has really harmed, from my perspective, the benefit that the United States gained from its position. And where the United States had always been able to have the greatest leverage over China, it wasn't US v. China, it was all of the US partnerships. And that is what is no longer the case. And the US still has, for the most part, very good military to military relationships. And we can argue that it has very good intelligence sharing relationships, but not on trade, not on investment. And that is what I think is harming the US in the long run. I would argue the US has always had an America First policy. But what has changed is not that we have gone from not having an America First policy to having an America First policy. It's that we used to recognize that working with partners and allies and being part of a global rules-based system, which the United States was one of the core architects of, was in our national interest. It was what put America first. And we no longer do that. And the question is, after this administration, will the US come back to working with partners and allies? And will those partners and allies ever trust the US like they did? I have seen no sign that China is now adopting the old model of having partners and allies to benefit itself. China is still doing everything that it has always done. I would say the US has become more like China, not the other way around. And that's the real question to watch as to how the geopolitical framework will go forward after Trump leaves office. Will we continue along this path, or will we come back somewhat to working with partners and allies and having some type of global rules-based trading system? And will people even welcome that if the United States' next administration wants it? I think we had one more question over here. Oh, wait. All right. 4 more questions. All right. And then we'll, okay.
What about the China plus one policy projected during the COVID? Just tell me about that, where we are, and are we really taking it serious or not?
Okay, well, I'll take them both at the same time. I could do China plus one.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Steven. I'm Anada Pitsuwan from Bangkok Business, Thailand. I'd like to get back to the theory behind the thing that you present, which is industrial policy and protectionism. But this idea against the free trade with every country trying to engage with the global. So my question is, what do you think that how developing country can climb up the ladder in terms of this tension going? How we can catch up with the developed country in terms of economic development? And the bits that you mentioned earlier about the rule-based order. Thailand or other developing country, we used to use the bamboo diplomacy, which which is too flexible. Do you think it's going to change after this, and how we can benefit most on this tension? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll take these two, and then we'll move on to the next section, and then we'll take more questions. So, with China plus one is a strategy that is not just American companies and Western companies and Japanese companies which said that they need to diversify out of China. It is Chinese companies are predominantly using the China plus one strategy. And that is because really, COVID was the wake-up call that putting all of your eggs in one supply chain basket was a mistake. You should not, yes, it is the cheapest thing to do. It is the most efficient thing to do, but it is the highest risk thing to do. And if you have all of your supply chain in one location, and that location shuts down for whatever reason, your whole business is at risk. And that is why you always want to diversify your supply chain. It comes at a cost, but it brings a benefit. And so what was the risk that we see in China if you are going to put all of your eggs in the China supply chain basket, right? COVID zero. That was clearly a risk where the government could come in and shut down your factories, and you had very little recourse to do that. You have other type of political risk in China. What if China says we're no longer going to allow obviously not manufacturing, but we're no longer going to allow tutoring. Well, if you had all of your tutoring companies in China, you lost most of your business overnight. So you have a lot of risk that you have if you are in China and only in China. You have political risk, you have COVID risk, you have climate crisis risk, and so what then really accelerated, of course, was the geopolitical risk, and that was the U.S. putting tariffs onto China. And so when the U.S. put roughly a 35% tariff on China, where it is today, and they have a 20% tariff on Vietnam or a 19% on Thailand, that 15% made it even more critical that you diversify out of China, and that those Chinese factories leave China and come to Thailand and Vietnam and across Southeast Asia. Now, one of the things you really want to watch is that geopolitical risk could reverse. And so what happens if the Chinese tariff differential gets lower than 15%? What if China goes down to 30 and Vietnam goes up to 25? Some of those companies that diversified out of China, the Chinese ones in particular, will go back. Or if they diversified to Thailand, they will go back because the cause for that is no longer there, and that is the higher tariff differential between the U.S. and China. So one of the things that I think, I'm told this to the New York Times, and I've told this elsewhere, is I think that tariff differential will remain at 15 because the U.S. government knows that if that tariff goes up too high in Southeast Asia and doesn't go up in China and that differential shrinks, that will reverse China plus one. Because the cost of manufacturing outside of China is very high. Look, you don't have the logistics. When I talk about Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia doesn't have the logistics. They don't have the human capital. They don't have all of the different suppliers in one location to source. And so it is just so much more efficient to go to and manufacture in China as part of your supply chain that China plus one will reverse to some degree. There's still reasons to not put all your eggs in the China supply chain basket, but it will reverse to some degree. So what is it that countries like, especially in this situation, that Thailand and others should do? You need to find ways to attract investment to make yourselves more competitive. One of the things that I'm working on is the American Association of the Indo-Pacific that's in these reciprocal tariff agreements, these ARTs, are eliminating non-tariff barriers in countries like Thailand, in countries like Vietnam. A lot of what we talk about, I'm not sure how much Deb talked about this yesterday, these non-tariff barriers that governments erect. It could be foreign direct investment restrictions. It could be vague customs rules. It could be a lack of transparency into other rules. It could be data localization if we want to talk about IT and what's coming with AI. And so eliminating those non-tariff barriers is one of the things governments should be doing to making themselves more competitive. Yes, tariffs are the headline, but you know what? Tariffs aren't going anywhere under the Trump administration. They are here to stay, and I think they are here to stay in the next administration to some degree, whether it is a Democrat or a Republican, whether it is a free trader or somebody who's more protectionist. So we now live in a world of tariffs. We have to accept it. We don't have to like it, but we have to accept it, and then we have to figure out how we diversify out of that. And the other thing that governments like Thailand should be doing and are doing is finding those new trading partners to create an alternative to what used to be the global rules-based trading system that Deb probably said yesterday has now been destroyed, which I agree with. So we're going to come to trade, and then all right, last one. Yeah, all right, microphone over here. Last one before we get to the next one.
Thank you very much for taking my question. My name is Fatima Nazish and I'm from Pakistan. I work for DW, the German TV. So my question is not just in a China perspective, but also Pakistan. That how can Pakistan business benefit from the China's economic corridor in terms of trade? And also everyone knows that we are not trading with India. The Afghanistan border is also remained closed since 10 months. So in this condition, how you see the future of Pakistan state?
Well, I'm not a Pakistan expert, but I mean, I think to broaden it out to all, yeah, you need to be trading with China. You need to be getting investment from China, but you also have to recognize what are there strings that come with that investment? What are the rules that are going to apply to that investment? And you can negotiate with China like you can negotiate with the United States. You don't have a lot of leverage with either of those governments right now. But I mean, I think I would say what I would say to businesses as governments start to take investment, could be from AAIB or Belt and Road or whatever it might be, just understand what you are investing in. What are the rules? But you don't have a choice, right? You have to do that. All right, let's move on to trade more broadly, and we'll talk about Trump's favorite economic weapon. Economic weapon. It is tariffs. It is the most beautiful word in the dictionary to Donald Trump. Tariffs are not going anywhere. They are here to stay. And what is he going to do? He'll find a way to make them stay. The initial plan, right, was the emergency tariffs under IEPA was the statute in the United States. The Supreme Court said, no, that's not legal. So what happened? He then said, okay, we're now going to pivot to something called Section 122. And that gave him the authority to issue tariffs up to 15%, but he did 10% basically on the world. Section 122 is only a stopgap measure. It only lasts for 6 months. It expires on my birthday. So you can all wish me a happy birthday when the 122 tariffs expire. So what is he doing now? He knew this from the beginning. And of course, he has a very capable U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer. And so Jameson Greer and USTR has set out multiple paths to investigation after they issued the 122 tariffs. You have 232 tariffs, and these are based on specific sectors, typically on national security. You also have Section 301 tariffs, which are based on unfair trading practices. And we've heard announcements now from the United States on the first set of new Section 301 tariffs. And these are going to be on human rights violation and forced labor violation. So the United States did an investigation of these 60 governments, including the government here in Singapore, and it found all 60 of those governments did not protect the supply chain from goods manufactured with forced labor. And because of that, the United States has said it will issue tariffs on those governments, either 10% or 12.5%. And the hearings are going to take place in, I think, about 2.5 weeks or so. And I will predict on or by my birthday, these tariffs will now get implemented because they will replace the Section 201 tariff. So this is how You talk to someone like Deb, in the Hinrich Foundation about tariffs and how they get implemented and what the impact will be. I look more at the geopolitical perspective and the political perspective, saying this is why it's getting done, when it's going to get done, and that's when our two expertises can come together. So this is what the U.S. is going to do on tariffs. I know the hearing hasn't taken place yet. I know what the answer, what the result of that hearing is going to be. So what is it that governments are doing, because tariffs are here to stay? So this is an op-ed. My friend, a former USTR official, Kelly Myman, and I wrote in the South China Morning Post on Thursday of last week. And we call it quiet quitting. And so this is something I think that reporters should be really looking at. So what is quiet quitting? Well, quiet quitting in the context of work is when you kind of stop working. You don't like your boss. You don't like what the company's doing. But you'll just, kind of hang out and get paid. And that is referred to as quiet quitting. Well, we think quiet quitting applies in the trade context as well. Mark Carney, when he gave what is now his very famous speech at Davos, where he said the middle powers should come together. And that really, frankly angered President Trump. And he has taken and continues to take shots at Canada and Carney over that public call for the middle powers to come together. Well, all those governments are doing what Mark Carney said to do. They're just not talking about it publicly, but they're negotiating all of these trade agreements. The EU and India have a trade agreement. That would have been one of the last trade agreements I ever would have predicted in my life. The EU, from an American perspective, very difficult to deal with. India, very difficult to deal with. Yet on trade, yet the EU and India come together on a trade agreement. You see the UK in the CPTPP. You see the EU talking about the CPTPP. You see other governments like Philippines, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in South Korea, talking about joining the CPTPP. You see the countries in the Americas and Mercosur coming together. They're not being very loud about it, but this is what the quiet quitting is going on in trade. And this is really one of the big stories to watch. And what countries, to your question, like Thailand are doing is they're trying to come up with an alternative to the former global rules-based trading system. And they are quitting the US and they are quitting China. They don't want China to be part of these rules because they will bring in China's unfair trade practices. They don't want the US to be part of this because the US under Trump is not following what would have been the whole basis of having a free trading system within certain rules. So you now have quiet quitting going on from the US and China, and it's something very interesting to watch because this is going to take years and years to happen, but we're seeing the start of it right now. So any more questions on trade, and then we'll move to the US.
Right. Hang on just a minute. One moment.
Yep.
That's right.
Just a question on what you spoke about quiet quitting. Do you think that you think that US and China, you kind of ignore them and you form your... Do you think it could even survive in this kind of environment?
Well, you don't ignore the US and China because you have to have a US policy. You have to have a China policy. As I said earlier, the US is essential. China is essential. You can't give up those markets. You have to be in those markets. But at the same time, you're looking for alternatives. You're looking for a different framework. You're looking, to find new trading partners. And so you have to be doing both at the same time. And that's why, while you're negotiating with the US, while you're working with China, you're quietly working with everybody else as well. And that is what the quiet quitting is. It's very difficult. I think that goes back to my first slide. How do you live in a world that is unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar all at the same time? We've never had to do this before, right? Never. I mean, that multipolar global trading system had been built over, 50 years, 80 years, whatever date you want to put in. Now we're starting all over again. And that's what's making this so difficult. But that's what the quiet quitting is trying to do.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, wait. Two more. One, and then we'll move on to the U.S.
As you said, on 24 July, your birthday.
Yeah.
the government has invoked Section 122 on Supreme Court verdict, and it will expire on 24 July. So what would be the scenario after that? These tariffs will continue to be imposed on the government. What would be the strategy of the government, Trump's government, because they wanted to they wanted to keep these tariffs on other countries. So can you tell me what would be the scenario after that?
Well, yeah, no. So basically, right, from the Trump position, tariffs achieve two purposes. One, it levels the playing field because the world has treated the United States unfairly through global trade imbalances, and also the U.S. needs to bring investment into the U.S. and tariffs serve both of those purposes. So you have to find a way to be able to. You have to have a legal justification to impose those tariffs. So first, it was the IEEPA tariffs. Supreme Court said that was illegal. Then they went to the Section 122 tariffs, but those only last for 6 months. The Section 301 tariffs will then be implemented, and they will be at least at 10%, if not higher. And there could be and what we don't know yet is what those numbers are going to be. And this is why you have to keep in mind that tariffs are relative. Right? If everybody's at a 10% tariff and everybody's at a 0% tariff, well, then it doesn't really matter. But if somebody's at a 10% tariff and somebody's at a 20% tariff and somebody's at a 50% tariff, then that really matters, because that can shift where you're going to invest or have your supply chains. And so what we need to now watch next is, we know the first set of tariffs are either 10 or 12.5%. What about the next set of tariffs? Are they going to be on top of those? Are they going to be just, side by side and you stay at a lower amount? We don't know. I just think that the tariff differential between China and Southeast Asia has to be at least 15%. That I will predict. The rest, it's very hard to tell.
Hang on, one moment.
Yeah, no. Under section 301, you have to find an unfair trading practice in each government, and it could be for different reasons. And then the Section 232 tariffs are by sector, and it's going to be something usually tied to aluminum or steel. Could be electronics more broadly. So that's where that'll all work out. All right, one more quick question and then two.
Hang on.
Okay.
Remember, wait for a mic.
Okay.
Where India stands in a whole scenario in the US-China trade war, because for a few years back, India was emerging as one of the manufacturing hub, but we don't know exactly where it stands in a global politics. This US-China trade war.
Okay, and then one behind, and then we'll.
Hi, this is Raja from the MOOC Naik, India. Do you think that in coming days, multipolar trade will be the reality? Because everyone is watching China and US trade war. So multipolar, just like the mother of all deal between EU and India, is, in my opinion, is good option for the other countries. So multipolar trade or multipolar world will be a reality in your opinion?
Yeah, so first, in terms of India and why India is so important is because India is the one place in Asia outside of China where you have a domestic market and you can have an export market. Because it is much more efficient if you can have your manufacturing in a country that can both serve a domestic economy and you can use it to export. You can have one factory to do both as opposed to having factories in two different countries. So India by far is the future. Of course, there's so much that has to go into India in terms of supply chains and logistics and rules. But that is what is really critical, which is why governments are trying to do deals with India. It's why companies are looking to set up in India. It's why Apple is setting up in India and in other, Amazon. Others are looking at the Indian market. So India is really the critical market to follow. Now, again, though, that EU-India deal, I think, is really important because if you could put the EU-India deal together and you could put the EU and a CPTPP together, and then you could put India into that deal, now you have as significant a trading block as any other. If you could, that is going to be very difficult. I'm not going to say that is going to happen, but if that were to happen, that would really give you that alternative between China and the US. But that is years off, but at least those discussions are heading that way. All right, so we got 10 minutes. We'll talk about the midterms, because I just think it's really important for you to understand what's happening in Washington, why it's happening, and not to read too much, but also not to miss things as they come about. Most important thing to understand when it comes to the midterms is that the midterms are decided in the House in particular on the president's approval rating. Because that one number, if you see what President Trump's approval rating is, or any president's approval rating, that pretty much takes everything into account. That takes into account the economy. It takes into account how people view how their consumer confidence is. It's how the U.S.'s standing is in the world. It's what happens in domestic politics. And if a president's approval rating is below 50 and is certainly around 40, their party loses seats in the House. It happens every time because the House, with 435 elections all simultaneously, very hard for one House member to break away from their party. It can happen, but it as a rule, it doesn't. And so as you can see, where President Trump's approval rating tracking to be 37%, come November, he would lose his party would lose a, relatively speaking, massive number of seats. We're talking, a couple dozen, maybe even 3 dozen or so. And this year is very much shaping up like that 2006 election, where the Republicans lost both the House and the Senate. In 2006, it was a lot about Iraq. And in 2024 or 26, 20 years later, it could be a lot about Iran. The Iran war is very unpopular in the United States, just like the Iraq war was. And we could talk about why if you want later on. So we go into this thinking that in the House, for sure, the Democrats are going to take over. Now, the Senate is different because unlike the 435 seats up in the House, the Senate has about 30 seats up. And each state maybe has one, not even every state, but some states have 1 seat up. And so the senators can have an identity separate from the president easier than a House member can. So what we really need to watch is what's happening in very particular Senate races. Who's up? How do they stand? How does that state feel about the president? And the Democrats will need to win 4 or they need to win 5 seats to take the majority, because a tie goes to the Republicans because they have the White House. So the Democrats need to get to 51 seats. And one of the interesting things to watch is how Trump's trade policy and how his attacks, figurative, of course, not literal yet, figurative attacks on Canada have turned out through tariffs, through the USMCA negotiation, how he refers to Prime Minister Carney, how he refers to the country. Because there are 8 states that have Senate elections, 7 of them directly border Canada. One of them, Iowa, is close to Canada and has a large amount of its agricultural exports go to Canada. So it is very exposed to the Canadian economy. So these 8 states are really important to watch, because this is where the president's trade policy could impact a Senate election. This almost never happens. Usually U.S. elections are solely based on domestic. But this one can be different. So if you look at where the president's approval rating is, if you look at where the Senate races are, you would say in U.S. election terms, a blue wave is coming. So typically blue is Democrat, red is Republican, and this blue wave can be coming to take over the Capitol, like in 2006, where the Democrats get the House and the Senate. Now, why that may not happen. One of the things that this administration is focused on is potentially election interference. Could the Republicans and Trump and the executive branch do things that would change the rules? Will they put ICE agents at polling places? If they do, that could keep people from voting who might not have otherwise. Can they declare postal votes invalid? If they did that, that could change how the election came out. So there are still things that can be done that could change the election because the rules aren't what they had always been in the past. So that's one thing to watch. Another thing to watch is the manosphere. Everyone know what the manosphere is? We'll do a longer talk on the manosphere next time. But the manosphere basically is where you have, it is a part of the internet that is very much focused on young men. And it is very, frankly, misogynistic. It tends to be anti-Semitic. And it's a lot of voters who are what we in the US would call low propensity voters, people who don't often vote, yet they can be very influenced to go out and vote by what is referred to as the manosphere and by the leaders of the manosphere. So Kamala Harris in 2024 said she lost men to the manosphere. And the Republicans and MAGA are doing the same exact thing again. There are very serious policy goals behind the manosphere. Get rid of no-fault divorce, so make it more difficult for women to get a divorce from their husband. Do things to promote a family through tax law. And DEI. All of these things are policy goals that you have in the manosphere. And we see this playing out when they talk about a Senate candidate in Texas who very much could bring an upset, not will, but could bring an upset to Texas, a very red state. So how are they describing this Democrat, James Talrico? They say masculine would be one of the words I would never use to describe him. Stephen Miller in the White House after Talrico won said he would become the first transgender Senate candidate. He's not transgendered, but those are the types of attacks to watch. So one of the interesting things, if you're going to watch this election play out, is that there are ways that the Republicans can hold on, even though it looks like a blue wave is coming. And so what are the other issue really impacting U.S. politics and geopolitics is AI. I asked Noemi, who works with me, I said, come up with a slide to show a data center near a neighborhood and why there is such a backlash against data centers. And so Noemi put the slide together. And I said, well, no, don't use AI to generate this slide. Get a real photo of a data center near a neighborhood. She said, no, that's a real photo. That's in Virginia. And this is why there is such a backlash against data centers, because people don't want them near them. They drive up electricity costs. They use up water. They're, relatively speaking, loud. And they take away farmland or parkland, and they don't really bring jobs and economic benefit to those areas. So there is such a backlash against AI in the US right now. And Americans are viewing data centers as mostly bad or neither good nor bad. And this is from January, so I'm sure the numbers are way worse now when it comes to the environment, when it comes to energy costs, when it comes to quality of life nearby. Those are the issues of why AI is bringing such a backlash. Part of it is because of the data centers as the manifestation to that AI. And data centers at the ballot box are hurting people who have approved those data centers. It led to Democratic wins in Virginia, New Jersey, and Georgia. Wisconsin's revolting against them. Missouri's revolting against them. So this is a real issue to watch. Can Democrats or Republicans get the edge when it comes to AI in the midterms? The other issue that we have with AI is it leads to a K-shaped economy. At least it certainly is right now, because all of the economic gains are going to a small part of society. Those who are in the jobs that can take advantage of AI. Those who are in jobs that lost because of AI, they're losing. And a K-shaped economy cannot exist for a long period of time. There is going to be a rebellion if you have a K-shaped economy. And this is what those who are concerned about AI are focused on, both in the elections and in Washington, and should be in geopolitics as well. So this is an op-ed that Noemi and I and our colleague Megan wrote in November for Eco Business. And we said, businesses better be ready, because as these ESG risks mount from AI and the environment on business, on society, there is going to be a backlash. And this is what Prime Minister Trudeau, I should say former Prime Minister Trudeau, said in Singapore a month or two ago, that if the wealth is not felt by all, we are going to have a revolution if we are not responsible. So what is Washington trying to do right now? They are putting controls, right, on AI. And the question will be, is the controls that Washington is putting on AI, will they be as effective as the cleanup of the reflecting pool has been under the Trump administration? Or is this just going to be very difficult to control? But if you're sitting here in Singapore and you're using a system that the US then bans, what position is that going to put you in? And what are governments going to do about that? And are governments here going to do the same thing the United States does? So there is a great deal of sovereign risk when it comes to AI. And so what we have been working with on businesses and investors, and we think governments should be doing the same, is having some type of AI risk scenario analysis. As you have your AI policy as a business, yes, you can think that whatever you're doing today is going to be the same going forward when it comes to your access to AI, that it's going to be limitless and it's going to be affordable. But there's a second scenario where AI is available, but it is expensive. And those costs are going to go up because of sole sourcing risk, could electricity prices, could be of a lack of data centers and too much demand and not enough supply, or what happens if AI becomes rationed or sovereign. So these are the types of risks that are out there for AI. It's what politicians should be thinking about, and it is what governments should be thinking about, and it is what businesses should be thinking about. So I will close with this. I would say take the same advice that Xi Jinping gave to the party school when he talked to them in 2019. Xi Jinping said, you need to be focusing on black swans and gray rhinos. So everybody know what a black swan event is? No? All right. Ooh, somebody's shaking their head no. Okay, so a black swan event is something that happens once every 100 years. You don't worry about a black swan event, because if you spent your time focusing on something that happens once in a century, you're going to be wasting your time. 99% of the time, you're going to be wasting your money. But you should focus on a gray rhino. What is a gray rhino? A gray rhino is a problem that is big and ugly and staring you at the face that could potentially charge you, and you know that can happen, so you take precautions to keep the rhino from charging. Right? Don't jump up and down when you see a rhino. Don't blow a whistle. Don't click, click, click with your camera. Right? Take the precaution, and you can be ready for the gray rhino. We have 5 gray rhinos that we are facing right now. The Iran war showed that we need to become more self-reliant and that we need to have energy security. The US and China are adversaries. They are not in a truce. That adversarial relationship is going to stay. Globalism is going to continue to fracture. That brings positives, but it is going to bring opportunities. The climate crisis is only going to get worse, and AI disruption is going to happen. So focus as you watch the world on not the black swans, but the gray rhinos. And there is one more animal you need to be focused on, right? The orange elephant.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And I hate to be looming over you
Yes.
as the session comes to an end. But I can't thank you enough for taking us on this tour of politics and foreign policy and how it affects trade. So thank you so much.
Thank you.